high on a ridge in northern Georgia, nearly 3,000 feet above the valley floor, there's a wall, 885 feet of stacked stone, no mortar holding it together, zigzagging along a mountain summit for reasons nobody has ever fully agreed on. It doesn't enclose anything useful. It doesn't defend anything in particular. And more than a century after archaeologists first started studying it, nobody can tell you with certainty who built it or why. But the Cherokee had an answer long before archaeologists ever climbed that ridge. They called them the Moon-Eyed People, a race already living on that land when Cherokee ancestors arrived, pale-skinned, bearded, small in stature, unable to bear daylight, moving and working only at night. According to the tradition, the Cherokee fought them, drove them out during a full moon when their enemies were at their weakest, and inherited a landscape already scattered with stone structures someone else had built. That story wasn't invented for a campfire. It was written down in 1797 by a credentialed American scientist, decades before archaeology as a discipline even existed. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what's documented, what's genuinely still a mystery, and how a Welsh prince, who almost certainly never set foot in America, ended up hijacking a real Cherokee tradition for 200 years. When Cherokee ancestors established themselves across what's now western North Carolina, northern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, and parts of South Carolina, they weren't arriving into an empty wilderness. They were settling into a landscape with a long, layered human history already written into it. One that included, according to Cherokee oral tradition itself, and earlier people who'd occupied the mountain country before them. It's worth being precise about what's Cherokee tradition and what's outside speculation, because the two get blended constantly in popular retellings. The Cherokee are an Iroquoian language nation, and linguists and archaeologists have long debated exactly when Cherokee-speaking ancestors established themselves in the southern Appalachians relative to other groups in the region. Estimates and interpretations vary, and this remains an active area of scholarly discussion rather than a single settled timeline. What Cherokee oral tradition consistently maintains is that by the time Cherokee communities were established in this landscape, older stone structures on the mountain summits were already there, already old, and already unexplained, attributed to a people who came before. That's the core of the story known today as the Moon-Eyed People, a group the Cherokee described as physically distinct from any other people in their own genealogical memory, pale, bearded, and, in the most consistent detail across every version of the tradition, unable to function in daylight, not blind, not cursed in some vague supernatural sense, physically limited to nighttime activity in a way specific enough that it reads, in the earliest written accounts, more like observation than metaphor. By the time European settlers began recording these traditions in any detail, Cherokee society in the region was a sophisticated, well-organized political structure in its own right, a matrilineal clan system, established towns with distinct civic and ceremonial roles, and a documented history of diplomacy, trade, and conflict with neighbouring nations across the southeast. That context matters for how we should read the Moon-Eyed tradition. This wasn't a scattered, unremembered rumour drifting through a society with no organised way of preserving history. It came from a nation with active, structured oral history practices passed down through specific clans and speakers whose role, in many indigenous nations of the region, was precisely to carry historical and genealogical memory forward with accuracy across generations. That doesn't make the tradition automatically factual in every detail. Oral history, like written history, can shift and accumulate embellishment over time. But it does mean the tradition arrived in the historical record through a serious transmission system, not an offhand folk tale invented on the spot for curious settlers. It's also worth noting what the tradition does not claim. Nowhere in the earliest recorded versions are the Moon-Eyed People described as supernatural beings, spirits, or myth figures in the way, for instance. Later folklore sometimes describes the Cherokee's separate tradition of the little people, a distinct body of stories about small, spirit-like beings that some later retellings have blended with the moon-eyed tradition, but which most careful readers of the sources treat as a separate strand of Cherokee belief. The moon-eyed people, as recorded by Barton and by Sevier, are described in straightforwardly physical terms: a population with a specific appearance, a specific vulnerability, specific structures they built, and a specific war they lost. The earliest known written reference to this tradition appears in 1797 in a book titled New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America, written by Benjamin Smith Barton. Barton was a legitimate figure, a Philadelphia physician, professor of natural history, and member of the American Philosophical Society, the same learned society that counted Thomas Jefferson among its members. He was not a folklorist chasing campfire stories. He was one of the era's more serious scientific minds, turning his attention to the origins of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Barton didn't claim to have heard the tradition first-hand from Cherokee elders. He was careful about his sourcing, citing Colonel Leonard Marbury, a Revolutionary War officer who had served as an intermediary between Georgia's colonial government and the Cherokee, as the person who relayed the account to him. As Barton recorded it, the Cherokee told Marbury that when their ancestors first arrived in the country they inhabited, they found it already occupied by moon-eyed people, who could not see in the daytime, and that the Cherokee subsequently drove them out. A second independent account followed a few years later. John Sevier, a Revolutionary War officer who went on to become the first governor of Tennessee, recorded a conversation reportedly held around 1782 with the elderly Cherokee leader Oconostota, who died the following year. According to Sevier's later account, Oconostota told him that ancient fortifications scattered across the region had been built by a people who lived there before the Cherokee, and that this people had eventually been driven out after a period of conflict. It's worth flagging honestly here. The exact date and precise wording of Sevier's account come down to us through second-hand reporting, most directly through a letter and later newspaper retellings. So some specific details, including the date most often cited, carry a degree of uncertainty with their exact date and wording of Sevier's account. What's not in dispute is that Sevier, independently of Barton and Marbury, recorded a version of the same core claim. An earlier people, physically distinct, expelled from the land before the historic Cherokee period. Two separate recorders, working in different decades, drawing on different Cherokee sources, arriving at the same essential story. That's genuinely striking. And it's the reason this tradition has been treated seriously by historians for over 2 centuries, rather than dismissed as a single writer's invention. It's worth pausing on what moon-eyed actually meant, because even here the sources aren't perfectly unanimous. Barton's version, and most of the written tradition that follows it, describes the condition as an inability to see well in daylight, consistent with photosensitivity. A later Georgia State historical marker at Fort Mountain, erected in 1968, phrases it slightly differently, describing the moon-eyed people as unable to see during certain phases of the moon. A subtly different claim, tied to lunar cycles rather than sunlight generally. That inconsistency doesn't undermine the tradition's core claim of an earlier, displaced people, but it's a reminder that details drift as a story gets retold across 2 centuries of settlers, journalists, and tourism boards, and it's worth being honest about which version comes from which era of retelling. The tradition also persisted well beyond Barton and Sevier. Ethnographer James Mooney, who conducted extensive fieldwork among the eastern band of Cherokee in the late 19th century and published his findings around 1900 in a major study of Cherokee myths, documented related traditions and sketched sites connected to them, including petroglyphs at locations such as Track Rock Gap in Georgia. Newspaper accounts through the early 20th century, including a 1923 feature in a Chattanooga paper, kept the story circulating in regional popular memory well before any modern internet-era retelling picked it up. Roughly 40 miles from where some of these accounts were gathered, in the Cohutta Mountains of northern Georgia, Fort Mountain rises to just under 3,000 feet, and running across its summit is the wall the legend has always pointed back to. 885 feet of stacked, dry-laid fieldstone, no mortar, arranged in an irregular, zigzagging line, punctuated with roughly 24 stone cairns, small enclosures, and what may once have been a gateway. Early accounts describe the wall as considerably taller than what survives today. What remains now generally stands a few feet high, though sections reportedly reached greater heights when first documented by European settlers. Here's what makes the wall genuinely puzzling. Not internet mystery puzzling, but archaeologically puzzling. As a fortification, it's oddly designed. It doesn't fully enclose the summit, and an attacker could walk around significant stretches of it without much trouble. As a hunting structure for driving game, it's wildly oversized for that purpose. 2 small excavations conducted during archaeological surveys of the site turned up no artifacts at all, no pottery, no tools, no organic material, which is itself unusual and has made it that much harder to pin down who built it or why. Most archaeologists lean towards some kind of ceremonial, territorial, or observational purpose, but that remains an interpretation rather than a settled conclusion, and Georgia's own state park interpretive materials are candid that the wall's true purpose has never been definitively established. Dating is the other core problem, and it directly connects back to the 18th century testimony. Stone doesn't carbon date, only organic material does, and since the excavations at Fort Mountain found none, any age estimate has to come from comparing the wall to similar, better dated sites in the region. Published estimates for construction have ranged fairly widely across different studies and surveys. From as early as the late Archaic or early woodland period, roughly 1,000 years or more before the Common Era, through the Middle Woodland period around 500 BCE to 500 CE, up to later estimates that extend into the Mississippian period as late as 1500 CE. That's a genuinely wide range, and it reflects real, unresolved uncertainty in the archaeological record rather than a hidden consensus. But even at the later end of that range, most estimates place the wall's construction before the historic Cherokee presence in the immediate region is well documented archaeologically. In other words, whichever end of that range turns out to be closer to correct, the wall was very likely already old and already unexplained by the time Cherokee communities were established there in the form recorded by early European settlers. Fort Mountain isn't an isolated case either. Early European settlers moving into eastern Tennessee and northwestern Georgia in the late 1700s reported encountering a whole chain of similar fieldstone structures: cairns, low stone rings, cylindrical piles, and low walls scattered across mountain and hill summits between what's now the Chattanooga area and Stone Mountain, Georgia. Many of these were later destroyed for road fill or lost to development before they could be properly studied, which is itself a real loss for anyone trying to answer these questions today. The ones that survive share the same basic pattern as Fort Mountain: uncertain age, debated purpose, and no surviving artifacts that name their builders. To take the Moon-Eyed People tradition seriously as more than folklore, it helps to establish what's well documented about the people who most plausibly built these structures. The indigenous societies of the woodland period, roughly spanning the centuries from around 1000 BCE to 1000 CE across the eastern United States, extending in some regional chronologies into the later Mississippian period after that. This was not a simple or thinly organized population. Woodland period peoples across the southeast built substantial ceremonial earthworks, participated in long-distance trade networks that moved copper, marine shell, and other materials across thousands of miles, and in sites like the Adena and Hopewell earthworks of the Ohio Valley, and later Mississippian centers such as Cahokia, constructed monumental architecture with demonstrable, published, peer-reviewed astronomical alignments. This is a population demonstrably capable of large-scale, coordinated, generationally sustained construction projects, building 885 feet of stacked stone across a mountain summit is well within the range of what we know these societies were capable of. What the archaeological record can't currently tell us is which specific group within that broad and long-running cultural tradition built this particular wall, or what happened to the people who built it. That's precisely the gap the Cherokee tradition offers to fill. Not proof, but a specific, historically transmitted claim that a distinct people occupied this landscape, built these structures, and were displaced through conflict before the historic Cherokee period as documented by European settlers. There's a broader pattern worth placing this inside. Population movement, displacement, and cultural replacement were ongoing, documented realities across the pre-contact southeast for thousands of years, long before any European ship reached the coast. Archaeological surveys across the region show clear transitions between distinct cultural traditions over time, shifts in pottery style, settlement pattern, mound construction, and material culture that mark the boundaries between the archaic woodland and Mississippian periods, and between distinct regional traditions within each. Nations rose, expanded, contracted, merged, and in some cases disappeared from the archaeological record long before Europeans arrived to write any of it down. Against that backdrop, a Cherokee tradition describing an earlier population being displaced from a specific mountain landscape isn't an outlandish claim requiring a fringe explanation. It's consistent with what we already know happened repeatedly across this same region for centuries. The difference here is simply that in this one case, an oral tradition happened to survive long enough and get written down early enough that we can still hear an echo of it today. This is where 2 centuries of retellings have done real damage to the original tradition. So let's separate carefully what's documented from what got bolted on afterward. Fact: the core Cherokee tradition is genuinely old and genuinely documented, appearing independently in Barton's 1797 publication and in accounts attributed to Sevier from the 1780s to 1810s. Decades before professional archaeology existed to weigh in, and long before any modern ancient mysteries media had a chance to shape how the story was told. Myth that the Welsh Prince Madoc explains any of it. This is the piece of the story that most needs correcting, because it dominated the conversation for 2 centuries, and it's almost entirely without foundation. The legend holds that a Welsh prince named Madoc sailed to America around 1170, centuries before Columbus, and founded a colony that eventually built fortifications and fought indigenous peoples before vanishing into the continent. The story's earliest known appearance in print dates to the late 16th century, during a period when England had clear political motives to assert a historical claim to North America that predated Spanish colonization, which is very likely why the story gained traction when it did. John Sevier's own account explicitly linked the Moon-eyed tradition to this Welsh legend, and for the next 200 years, explorers and researchers repeatedly went looking for Welsh-speaking indigenous tribes to confirm it. Every single search failed. No Welsh-speaking indigenous nation was ever verified. No medieval Welsh artifact has ever been confirmed anywhere in North America. No European material culture has been found in the southeast that predates Spanish expeditions in the 1500s. After more than 2 centuries of searching, the Madoc theory has produced no verified physical evidence, and modern historians treat it as pseudo-history, not a live hypothesis, myth with real historical weight to it, that stone structures like Fort Mountain must have been built by a vanished other race rather than indigenous peoples themselves. This is worth naming directly because it's not a harmless embellishment. Throughout the 19th century, a closely related idea, often called the mound builder myth, was widely promoted in American popular writing. The claim that the elaborate earthworks and mounds built by indigenous peoples across the Midwest and Southeast couldn't possibly have been built by the ancestors of the native nations living there, and must instead have been the work of a vanished, non-indigenous lost race, Welsh, Israelite or otherwise. 19th century archaeology eventually and firmly debunked this myth, establishing that these were the achievements of indigenous peoples themselves. That history matters here because the Madoc version of the Moon-Eyed People story sits in exactly that same tradition of explaining away indigenous achievement, which is part of why serious historians today are careful to separate the genuine old Cherokee tradition from the European colonial explanation that got layered on top of it decades later, fact treated with appropriate caution, the albinism hypothesis. Some researchers, including Barton himself in his original 1797 book, speculated that the tradition might describe a community with a significant incidence of albinism, a genuine, documented condition causing pale skin and extreme photosensitivity in which direct sunlight can cause real pain and impaired vision. A community with a notable prevalence of albinism would plausibly have appeared strikingly pale by comparison to their neighbours, and would have had real physical reasons to favour nighttime activity. This idea has circulated for over 2 centuries precisely because it fits the daylight sensitivity detail unusually well. But it remains speculative. There's no skeletal or genetic evidence tying any specific archaeological population in this region to albinism, and it doesn't on its own explain the organized construction of stone walls across multiple mountain summits. Fact, there is a real physical soapstone object connected to this tradition, and it deserves more careful treatment than a quick mention. In the early 1840s, a farmer named Felix Ashley, sometimes recorded as Axley, uncovered a carved soapstone and talc statue while clearing land near what is now Murphy, North Carolina. The piece stands roughly 3 feet tall and depicts 2 conjoined figures with oval heads and unusually large crescent-shaped eyes. It remained largely in private hands for well over a century before finally going on public display at the Cherokee County Historical Museum in 2015, where it remains today, associated by local tradition with the Moon-Eyed People. Its exact age has never been scientifically established, and archaeologists cannot say with confidence who carved it, when, or precisely what it was meant to represent. But its large, exaggerated eyes have long invited comparison to nocturnal adaptation, whether as literal observation or symbolic representation. It's also worth being clear about what the statue can't tell us. Its exact carving date has never been established through any scientific method. Its find context is a 19th century farmer's field rather than a controlled excavation, and there's no way to independently confirm it was made to represent the Moon-Eyed tradition specifically, rather than being connected to it after the fact by local storytelling. That doesn't make it meaningless. Object and oral tradition converging in the same region is genuinely interesting, but treating it as confirmed physical proof of the legend overstates what a single, undated, out-of-context artifact can actually establish. None of these explanations accounts for everything on its own. The woodland period construction hypothesis explains who was capable of building the wall, but not the specific physical details in the tradition. The albinism hypothesis explains the daylight sensitivity, but not the coordinated stonework. The soapstone figure connects to the tradition without proving who made it or why. What all 3 point toward, taken together, is a real, physically distinct population whose presence in this landscape predates the historic Cherokee period, remembered specifically enough across multiple independent recordings to suggest an actual historical encounter rather than a purely invented tale, Fort Mountain is now the centerpiece of Fort Mountain State Park, established in 1936, where the wall remains protected, studied, and open to hikers on a maintained trail. A Georgia State historical marker placed at the site in 1968 references the Moon-Eyed legend directly, though modern park and historical materials are increasingly careful to separate the documented Cherokee tradition from the debunked Welsh Madoc edition. A distinction historians are still actively working to make clearer for the public. The soapstone statue in Murphy draws visitors to the Cherokee County Historical Museum, sitting alongside the community's other collections as a genuinely unresolved piece of regional history, rather than settled proof of anything. Academic treatment of the tradition today generally falls into a careful middle ground, taking the documented, centuries-old Cherokee oral tradition seriously as a real historical claim worth investigating, while explicitly rejecting the pseudo-historical Welsh colonist framing that got attached to it in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that, for 200 years, crowded out more serious engagement with what the Cherokee testimony actually said. The story's popularity hasn't faded with time. If anything, it's grown, fueled over the last decade by paranormal-themed television segments, regional tourism content, and no shortage of online retellings that lean toward lost civilization framing rather than careful history. That popularity comes with a real cost. It makes it harder, not easier, to have a clear-eyed conversation about what's actually documented. A tradition this old and this consistently recorded deserves better than being flattened into either pure ghost story content on one side or a colonial lost white race narrative on the other. The eastern band of Cherokee Nation and other Cherokee communities continue to be the primary, appropriate authority on how their own oral traditions should be understood and shared. A point worth remembering any time this story gets retold for entertainment. Strip away the Welsh prince, and what's left is what was always there from the start. A documented, twice independently recorded Cherokee tradition, written down as early as 1797, describing an earlier people who lived in these mountains, looked physically distinct, built stone structures across the summits, and were eventually driven out. A wall on Fort Mountain that the best available archaeological evidence places before the historic Cherokee period in the region. A soapstone statue with strange, oversized eyes, unearthed by a farmer in the 1840s and still sitting in a glass case in Murphy, North Carolina today. None of it is proof, in the strict scientific sense, of exactly who the Moon-Eyed people were. But none of it is contradicted by the physical evidence either, which, after 2 centuries dominated by a theory that produced 0 verified artifacts, is genuinely more than the alternative explanation could ever claim. The wall is still there, the statue is still there, and the tradition that named them first was never the mystery. It was the answer everyone was too busy chasing a Welsh prince to listen to. If you want more documentaries that dig past the myths that got layered onto real Indigenous history and get back to what the evidence actually supports, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments